had just moved to Arizona for school, and I didn't know anyone there, and I was pretty lonely. There were these guys who would get together every week to play board games, and one of my classmates invited me to come one day. So I went and I hung out with them, and everything seemed fine, but I was never invited back. I asked my classmate what happened. He told me that one of the guys decided I wasn't welcome to hang out with them because I was too slow. Not slow in the sense of unintelligent, but literally slow. Slow to take my turn, slow to make decisions, that kind of thing. Can you relate to that? If you can, you might have cognitive disengagement syndrome. Or you might not. Either way, let's talk about it. Cognitive disengagement syndrome, formerly known as sluggish cognitive tempo, is characterized by daydreaming, underactivity, and mental confusion. As of this recording in 2026, cognitive disengagement syndrome, CDS for short, is not well known. It's not even in the standard guides psychiatrists and clinical psychologists use for diagnosis. However, based on scientific research, we can confidently say that CDS is real. I'm Stephanie Northover, a person with CDS, and this video will cover the basics of CDS. Let's get started. Researchers are still identifying the symptoms of CDS, but have tentatively settled on 3 symptom domains: daydreaming, hypoactivity, and mental confusion. The daydreaming domain includes symptoms like getting lost in thought, spacing or zoning out, appearing lost in a fog, staring blankly into space, and, of course, daydreaming. The hypo in hypoactivity means under, so you can think of hypoactivity as underactivity. The hypoactivity domain includes symptoms like getting easily tired or fatigued, having slow behavior, being drowsy or sleepy during the day, and, of course, being underactive. Finally, the mental confusion domain includes symptoms like losing your train of thought, having a hard time putting thoughts into words, forgetting what you were going to say, having mixed up thinking, getting easily confused, and thinking slowly. I can hear some of you objecting. You're thinking, maybe slowly, that most of these so-called symptoms are normal. And you're right, kind of. Everyone daydreams or loses their train of thought from time to time. I'm not saying that people who experience these things have CDS. I'm saying that people with CDS experience these things more. Some amount of daydreaming is normal, but if you're spending half of your waking time daydreaming, you might have CDS. I can imagine another objection right about now. Some of you are probably thinking it's stupid to put a label on every single person who does something more than or less than most people do. I'd like to clarify that no one's saying that everyone whose mind wanders excessively or who frequently loses their train of thought has CDS. Someone with CDS has a high degree of many of these symptoms, not just 1 or 2. It's the combination of symptoms that matters. On the flip side, it's also important to point out that someone with CDS doesn't necessarily experience all of these symptoms. For example, I feel like most of these symptoms apply to me, but I don't find it particularly hard to put thoughts into words. Or do you disagree? How am I doing? How do you know then if you have CDS? CDS is not in the latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, nor the International Classification of Diseases, so there are no official guidelines regarding diagnosis. Yet. However, researchers studying CDS have their own methods of tentatively identifying individuals with CDS. Let's say you were a participant in a study. Typically, you would be asked how often you experience a certain CDS symptom, or how well that symptom describes you. For example, are you sometimes, often, very often, or not at all slow at doing things? You would get a certain number of points depending on how you answered. For example, if you said not at all, you'd get 0 points. If you said sometimes, you'd get 1 point, often 2 points, and very often 3 points. Then you'd repeat the process for a second symptom, a third symptom, and so on. The researchers would add up your points for all the symptoms to determine your overall CDS score. The greater the number of points, the higher your score. It's kind of like a game you'd rather not win. Much of the research on this topic is interested in the relationship between CDS scores and other things, like depression or stress, rather than treating CDS as something that some people simply have and others don't. This perspective treats CDS symptoms as a continuum, with everyone falling somewhere on the continuum according to their scores. Other research is interested in how people with high CDS scores compare as a group to other groups of people. For example, researchers may compare 4 groups of participants: a group with ADHD, a group with high CDS scores, a group with both ADHD and high CDS scores, and a neurotypical group. In studies like these, researchers place participants in a CDS group if their scores are particularly high, for example, higher than at least 95% of the participants. Scientific research on CDS arguably began in the 1980s, but didn't really pick up until the 2000s. However, we may find roots of this research further back in time. A mental health textbook published in 1798 might contain the oldest case study of CDS, or at least a description of someone with similar symptoms. The author, Alexander Crichton, described a young man with the most uncommon
degree of absence of mind. He seemed lost to everything around him. If his countenance was attentively observed, it was easy to discover that a multiplicity of thoughts were constantly succeeding each other in his mind. In the course of his disorder, he became so remarkably inattentive that even when pressed by some want which he wished to express, he would, after he had got halfway through the sentence, suddenly stop, as if he had forgotten what he had to say.
Fast forward to the 1900s, and researchers interested in so-called personality problems are paying attention to symptoms of daydreaming, drowsiness, and absent-mindedness. A paper published in 1971 describes some children as inattentive, drowsy, and easily confused, and they referred to this cluster of symptoms as sluggishness. Research on CDS commenced in the mid-1980s. This early research was primarily interested in ADHD. For those who don't know, ADHD, which is short for Attention Deficit/Hyperactivity Disorder, is characterized by symptoms of inattention and/or hyperactivity and impulsivity. At the time, ADHD was split into 2 subtypes. Some researchers noticed that children from one subtype were rated by their teachers as drowsier and more sluggish than those from the other subtype. As time passed, researchers took more interest in this constellation of symptoms, which they generally called sluggish cognitive tempo. In 2023, a group of researchers gave sluggish cognitive tempo a new name. There were 2 reasons for this. First, the term sluggish may come off as demeaning, as someone may take it to mean lazy or unintelligent. Second, sluggish cognitive tempo is not an accurate description. The weight of the evidence does not support the idea that people with this disorder have slow cognitive processing. The term the workgroup came up with was cognitive disengagement syndrome, CDS for short. This refers to the way cognitive processes disengage or disconnect from external or outer stimuli. For example, suppose you're reading a textbook. The external stimulus is the textbook, or more specifically, the words you're reading in the textbook. As you read, you start thinking about something unrelated to what you're reading. Your attention has disengaged from the external stimulus, like a cat losing interest in the expensive toy you bought him. The workgroup cautioned that the name may change again in the future as scientists come to understand CDS better. For now, however, we have a name that is accurate and not offensive. Therefore, I encourage everyone to use the name Cognitive Disengagement Syndrome, or CDS, rather than sluggish cognitive tempo. For years, researchers have sought to determine whether CDS is best conceived as a subtype of ADHD or a separate disorder. Attention problems seem to be a major component of both. For example, both a person with ADHD and a person with CDS may struggle to stay focused on a task. However, the specific ways in which they lose focus are believed to differ. Someone with ADHD may get distracted by something in the environment, such as a sound, in other words, something external, whereas someone with CDS may get distracted by their own off-task thoughts, something internal. And although folks with ADHD and folks with CDS may experience some of the same general kinds of impairments, such as academic impairment, the degree of impairment tends to differ, and research has potentially found impairments associated with CDS that are not associated with ADHD. Furthermore, research suggests there are some biological differences between folks with CDS and those with ADHD, namely in cerebral blood flow, genes, brain structure alterations, and the vestibular system, which has to do with balance and spatial orientation. These findings await replication, however, so interpret with caution. Many researchers have argued that the evidence is consistent with ADHD and CDS being separate disorders. That being said, uncertainty remains, and the issue has not yet been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. ADHD and CDS at the very least seem to be related to each other. People with ADHD often have CDS, and people with CDS often have ADHD. Results of a large study suggest that roughly half of U.S. adults with ADHD also have CDS, and vice versa, and studies of Western children suggest that about 1/3 of those with ADHD also qualify for CDS, and about 1/2 of those who qualify for CDS also qualify for ADHD. Studies imply that CDS scores increase slightly with age throughout childhood, and then hold steady or decrease slightly throughout adulthood. Why do childhood CDS scores increase? There seem to be at least two possibilities, which are not mutually exclusive. One is that CDS symptoms grow in number or severity as children grow older. The other is that CDS symptoms become more noticeable as children are given more challenging schoolwork, greater responsibilities around the house, and so on. My personal experience is consistent with both possibilities. I didn't experience daytime sleepiness until I was 10. It felt like my brain went through a sudden change. Up to that point, I used to wake up early every morning full of energy. Suddenly, I was a night owl, and it took my mom ages to get me out of bed in the morning, and I was sleepy all day. I'm pretty sure daytime sleepiness was a symptom I developed around age 10, but I think increasing demands made some other symptoms that I already had more noticeable over time. I always had difficulty focusing on homework, for example, but as the amount of homework increased year by year, that difficulty focusing became more and more obvious. I spent long hours working on homework, and eventually I even had to pull occasional all-nighters. Living with CDS can be pretty hard. On top of the challenges presented by CDS symptoms, researchers have found evidence that people with CDS are more likely to experience impairments and dysfunction in many domains. Let's go over some of them. If you recall, one of the symptoms of CDS is daytime sleepiness. Maybe it's not surprising then that folks with CDS are more likely to report poor sleep. They also report their sleep being disturbed more often for reasons such as pain, bad dreams, being too hot or too cold, or simply waking up in the middle of the night. Research suggests they get fewer hours of sleep. Additionally, they report more trouble staying awake during activities and more trouble maintaining enough enthusiasm to get things done. They are also more likely to be night owls. Although night owl is a bit of a misnomer. Obviously, owls don't have CDS. Owls are bipolar. CDS is generally associated with social impairment. CDS symptoms are associated with shyness, a fear of social situations, a reduced ability to attend to social cues, a weaker memory for conversation, social withdrawal, social rejection, and loneliness. It has been said that loneliness is the silent killer. It has also been said that loneliness is a bummer. By me. People with CDS are more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, suicidal thoughts, and suicidal behaviors. They may experience more stress. They may be especially prone to physical symptoms like headaches, dizziness, stomach aches, feeling sick, and throwing up. CDS symptoms may also be associated with lower overall quality of life, which shouldn't be surprising after all the things I just listed. Quality of life measures evaluate the degree to which someone enjoys their life, feels their life is meaningful, is satisfied with themselves, has enough energy for daily life, and so on. CDS may be negatively related to executive function, which is a mental process we use to direct our behavior toward goals. Executive function allows us to override habitual and automatic thinking and instead engage in thinking that requires more concentration and mental work. The abilities that fall into the executive function category include ignoring distractions, identifying relevant information, dealing with new situations, and resisting temptation. Research may indicate that CDS symptoms are related to impairments in certain domains of executive function among adults and children. Let's talk about 3 of those domains. The first domain is time management. Impairments in time management may result in procrastination, failing to meet deadlines, arriving late for work or appointments, struggling to find the motivation to start and complete work, having trouble doing tasks by order of importance, and so on. The second domain is self-organization/problem solving. Impairments in this domain may result in trouble organizing thoughts, difficulty coming up with solutions to problems, struggling to learn new or complex activities, trouble explaining things to others, and processing information slowly or inaccurately. The third domain is emotional regulation. Impairments in this domain may result in emotional overreaction, difficulty concealing strong emotions, and struggling to shake off negative emotions. CDS symptoms may also be related to impairments in the areas of work, finances, and managing chores and household tasks. Folks with greater CDS symptoms have reported less satisfaction with their ability to perform daily living activities in general. What causes CDS? It's some combination of genes, environmental factors, and interactions between the two. There hasn't been a lot of research on this so far, so I don't have much to say about it. Interestingly, though, a study suggests that compared to ADHD, CDS is less influenced by genes and more influenced by environmental factors. CDS symptoms may be related to altered brain connectivity. At the most basic and oversimplified level, brain connectivity refers to the way neurons communicate with each other. You have a massive number of neurons in your brain, about 70 to 100 billion. In fact, if you were to place all of those neurons on the ground in a straight line starting from Los Angeles, you would die. As you probably know, when you use your brain for a mental activity, talking to someone, adding numbers in your head, whatever, different parts of your brain are more active than others. Let's talk about 2 of those parts. Please note that the following will be oversimplified. The brain is more complicated than I'm about to make it sound. First, there's the dorsal attention network. This part of the brain is active when your attention is turned to the outside, that is, the environment, the external, the world outside of your head. A study involving 29 preteens and teenagers found that CDS symptoms were associated with less activity in part of the dorsal attention network. In other words, kids in the study with more CDS showed less activity in the part of the brain that's important for paying attention to the outside world, something we CDS folks are not great at. This finding is very logical, but it needs to be replicated. Second, there's the default mode network. This part of the brain is associated with mind wandering and other kinds of inner focus. Recall that symptoms of CDS include excessive mind wandering, daydreaming, and zoning out, inner focus stuff. No wonder CDS researchers are interested in this part of the brain. Typically, when there's a lot of activity in the default mode network, inner focus, there is less activity in the dorsal attention network, outer focus, and vice versa. Neuroscientists would therefore say that these networks are anti-correlated. My degree's in psychology, so I would say that these networks are negatively correlated. I love the word anti-correlated, though. Anyway, it's as if the more focused you are on the outer world, the less focused you are on the inner world, and vice versa. Or at least, that's how a healthy neurotypical brain seems to work. A study found that these two brain regions were less anti-correlated among children with CDS. I think of it like my default mode network doesn't know when to quit. Like me and my dorsal attention network are alone in a room, quietly writing a paper, actually getting work done, when my default mode network suddenly throws open the door and says, "Hey, remember that time in high school when you and your friend cut class?" And then I spend several minutes reminiscing about my teenage years. And my college years, and thinking about the last episode of The Good Place, which was really sad, and wondering which Kate Bush album is my favorite, and on and on and on and on and on and on. Some of you guys get it, right? Right? Anyway, this research finding is really cool and it makes intuitive sense, but it needs to be replicated. In fact, a team of researchers conducted a similar study and did not replicate this finding. This doesn't necessarily mean the finding wasn't real. There were several differences between the two studies, such as the way CDS was measured, how many minutes the brain scan took, and the fact that participants in one study closed their eyes, whereas in the other study, their eyes were open. One or more of the differences between these studies may have affected the outcome. We need to wait and see how things shake out in the long run. Science can be messy, especially when research on a topic is new. Cognitive disengagement syndrome is thought to be associated with symptoms like daydreaming, zoning out, losing your train of thought, mental confusion, and being tired during the day. Although CDS seems similar to ADHD, it's most likely a separate disorder. CDS is not in the standard diagnosis guides, probably because it's not yet well understood. Research didn't take off until the 2000s. CDS can be hard to live with, not just because the symptoms are challenging, but because CDS is associated with sleep problems, social problems, depression, anxiety, executive dysfunction, and other issues. Cognitively, the CDS mind tends to disengage from the external world. Neurologically, certain brain networks may work differently. For those of you out there with CDS, I recognize your struggle. I want you to know that researchers are hard at work investigating CDS right now. I expect we'll have better resources and support in the future. So hang in there. My sincerest gratitude to the following people: